Small craft advisories for the south coast tomorrow of the Panhandle. South winds 30 knots there, seas around 20 feet. Central coast here east 25 knots with higher gusts, and east to north winds at 15 knots for the north coast. Lynn Canal northwest at 15, and northwest 20 knot wind, southeast 20 knots for Stevens Passage, and south 25 for Clarence Strait. And then swell craft advisories for southwesterlies at 25 knots there for the south coast on Thursday. West-southwest 20 knots for the central coast, and west winds at 20 for the north coast. And for Lynn Canal, southeast winds 10 knots, southeast at 15 for Stevens Passage, and southeast winds 20 knots for Clarence Strait. Prince William Sound tomorrow, small craft advisories northwest 30 knots with seas at 6 feet. Northwest 25 for the eastern Arctic or eastern North Gulf Coast, west side here. North winds at 30 knots with 9-foot seas. Strong gales out of the west for Kamishak Bay, 45 knots with 12-foot seas, and 40-knot northwest winds for the Barren Islands. Otherwise, Cook Inlet north to northwest, 10 to 20 knots. And for Cook Inlet on Thursday, north winds 15 to 20 knots, 3 to 5-foot seas. Lighter winds for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, but still northwest at 30 knots. North Gulf Coast, northwest 25-knot winds. And Prince William Sound, northwest 30 knots, seas at 7 feet. Kodiak Island, west-northwest 30 to 35 knots, northwest to 25 for Bristol Bay, west-northwest 20 to 25 knot winds for the Alaska Peninsula, strongest on the Pacific side of the peninsula. Here was also some higher gusts. And then for Thursday, southeast winds 20 to 25 knots for the Alaska Peninsula, north 20 for Bristol Bay, west winds 25 knots, 5 to 7-foot seas for Kodiak Island. Eastern Aleutians for tomorrow, west-southwest winds 20 to 25 knots. South winds here in the Adak-Atka area. Coming up as the front approaches from the west to 30 to 35 knots. And 30 to 35 knot winds here for the western Aleutians as well. And then for Thursday, north-northwest winds 30 knots here from Amchitka out to Shemya, Adak and Atka southwest to 20 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, south to southeast winds 30 to 35 knots. For the Kuskokwim Delta Coast, west winds 20 knots tomorrow. And the Yukon Delta Coast, northwest at 20 knots, northwest 20 for the St. Matthew Island area, southwest at 20 for the Pribilofs, and 25 knot west winds for St. Lawrence Island. But gale warnings for Norton Sound here. West winds 35 knots and those seas at 7 feet. Those fall back to northwest at 20 on Thursday there, and just 15-knot winds for St. Lawrence Island. Southwest coast here northeast 10 to 20 knots. Gale warnings for St. Matthew Island northeast at 35 knots, seas 11 feet, east at 30 knots for the Pribilof Islands. And for the Chukchi Sea tomorrow, quite a range here, 15 knots to 35 knots as you get down toward the Bering Strait out of the north, and northwest 15 for the western Arctic coast, west 15 to 20 for the central coast, and the eastern Beaufort Sea coast looking at west winds at 25 knots. And then kind of a variable north to west wind for the east side there for Thursday at 15 to 20 knots, southwest 15 for the central Arctic coast, and west 25 for the western coast. And for the Chukchi Sea, northwest winds 25 knots with 7 to 8-foot seas.